Hello, I'm Felix Torres, 31 years old. My story begins in a small corner of the west side, San Antonio, Texas, a place of dusty streets, rickety houses, and dreams often buried under the scorching sun of this land. From a young age, my mother always told me that my father was an addict, a gambler who died in a car accident when I was just 3. I believed he was a terrible man, and his death was a liberation for my mother and me. But 28 years later, as I became an employee of a major healthcare corporation in New York, everything unexpectedly unraveled. An accident, a call for blood donation, and an unbelievable coincidence brought me face to face with the powerful chairman, the man I admired most. We gradually grew close, until the day he caught a glimpse of my mother's photo in my wallet. He froze, his face pale, and with a trembling voice he stammered, "Adriana? You're Adriana's son? It can't be. But that's a story for later. Let me take you back to the past, to my childhood days in a tiny house where my mother, Adriana Torres, was my entire world. She was a Latin immigrant who came to the U.S. from a small village in Mexico when she was young, chasing a dream of a better life. She was petite, her frame slightly frail from years of relentless hard work. Her skin was tanned, weathered by long hours under the blistering Texas sun, and her long, glossy black hair was often tied back neatly with an old, worn scarf for convenience during work. I vividly remember her smile, rare but heartwarmingly tender. When she smiled, her deep brown eyes sparkled with a gentle light, as if she were embracing the entire world in her gaze. That look alone radiated boundless love, a wordless affection that could melt away the chill of the coldest winter nights. From the time I was little, I watched my mother work like a tireless bee. She held 2 jobs to raise me. By day, she was a laundress at a small laundry shop on the main street, standing for hours beside noisy washing machines, her hands submerged in scalding soapy water, folding wrinkled shirts for wealthy clients. Her hands were calloused, cracked from chemicals and cold water, yet she never complained. "I'm strong, mijo, don't you worry," she'd say softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. Then at night, when I went to bed, she'd head out again as a sanitation worker. She pushed a cart through dark alleys, collecting scraps of paper and bottles under the dim glow of streetlights. I'd often wake up in the middle of the night to the creaking sound of the cart's wheels outside my window, wondering to myself, why does she have to suffer so much? Why can't she rest? Every decision my mother made revolved around me. She saved every penny from her extra shifts to pay for my public school fees, sometimes skipping breakfast so I could have a new pencil. Our daily meals might consist only of stewed beans, homemade tortillas, and, if we were lucky, a piece of cheap meat. During freezing winters, she bought me a warm coat, the only one we could afford, by selling her favorite scarf. She always hid her hunger, her exhaustion. I remember coming home late from school one day to find her sitting at the kitchen table holding a piece of stale bread. When I walked in, she quickly swallowed it and smiled. "I'm full, mijo, you eat before it gets cold." I knew she was lying. Her stomach was growling, but I pretended not to notice because I was afraid of making her sad. But behind that smile, there was always a fleeting sadness in her eyes, like a shadow from the past. It wasn't always obvious, but it was there, enough for me to notice. Late at night, after her long evening shifts, I'd see her sitting quietly by the window, staring out at the dark yard where only the distant barking of dogs could be heard. Tears would roll down her cheeks, silent and lonely, and I wanted to run to her and hug her, but I was afraid of startling her. She'd quickly wipe them away when she saw me, flashing that familiar smile. "I'm just tired, mijo. Go to sleep." I'd lie on my creaky old bed under a thin blanket, wondering, what made her like this? Was it our impoverished life? Or was there something deeper, a pain she buried deep in her heart? Despite it all, to her I was her greatest pride. Whenever I got good grades in school, whether in math or for an essay praised by my teacher, she'd rush to tell the neighbors, her voice brimming with excitement as if I'd just won a Nobel Prize. "My Felix is so smart. He'll be a doctor or an engineer, you'll see," she'd tell Mrs. Maria across the street or Mr. Juan, the mechanic under the garage. Though we lived in poverty, she always made me feel like I was no less than anyone else. She bought me old books from flea markets and taught me to read by the flickering light of an oil lamp at night. "The world out there is vast, mijo. Don't let poverty hold you back. One day you'll break free from this cycle and become a successful man. I believe in you." Her faith was the flame that warmed me through the toughest days. But one thing always troubled me: my father. Whenever I asked about him, her eyes would darken. "Your father was an addict, a gambler," she'd say, her voice cold but trembling. "He died in a car accident when you were 3. Don't ask about him, Felix. We don't need him." I believed her without question. In my young mind, my father was a terrible man who abandoned us for the temptations of life. His death to me was deserved. I hated him, though I had no memories of him beyond my mother's words. But every time his name came up, I saw her clench her fists, as if holding back a storm of emotions. My childhood passed in that tiny house amid the noisy streets of the West Side. I grew up with the image of my mother, a small but resilient woman who dedicated her life to protecting me, giving me the opportunities she never had. From her, I learned that poverty isn't destiny, that with determination I could overcome anything. But I also learned that no matter how much she loved me, she carried a secret, one I was too young to understand at the time. I vividly remember the day I stood in front of the mirror at 15, staring into my own eyes and making a vow. "Felix, you have to succeed. Not for yourself, but for Mom." That promise wasn't just words. It was a fire burning in my chest. Every time I saw my mother return from her night shift, her hands red from chemicals, her eyes weary but still managing a smile, I knew I had no right to fail. She had sacrificed too much, skipped meals, clothes she never bought, sleepless nights to provide for me. I couldn't let those sacrifices be in vain. The West Side wasn't an easy place for a kid like me to stay focused. The streets were filled with temptations. Friends from the neighborhood urging me to join gangs, promises of easy money from shady dealings. But every time I wavered, my mother's image flashed in my mind. I remembered how she hugged me when I brought home a certificate of achievement, her voice brimming with pride. "Felix, you're my hope." I didn't want to be a failure, didn't want to disappoint her. Above all, I didn't want to become the kind of man my father was. A gambler, an addict, the man she said had abandoned us. In my mind, he was the embodiment of weakness, everything I had to avoid at all costs. When I turned 18, my first big opportunity came. I was accepted into the University of Illinois in Chicago to study for a bachelor's in medical laboratory science. It was a turning point, but also the first time I had to leave my mother, the West Side, and the tiny house where I grew up. Chicago was over 1,000 miles from San Antonio, and I knew the distance would weigh heavily on my mother's heart. On the day I boarded the bus, she hugged me tightly, her brown eyes shining with a mix of pride and worry. "Study hard, Felix," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But don't forget your mom, okay?" I nodded, holding back tears, but deep down I knew. I wasn't just going to study, I was stepping into a new world where I'd have to face every challenge on my own. Chicago was a shock to me. The city was vast, noisy, with towering skyscrapers and a relentless pace of life. I felt small, out of place, like a fish tossed out of its familiar pond. But I didn't let myself falter. I remembered my mother's words. "Pobreza no es destino." Poverty is not destiny. I threw myself into my studies, spending hours in the library, scribbling notes, completing assignments, and grappling with complex concepts in biology and medical diagnostics. But tuition and living expenses in Chicago weren't cheap. I didn't want my mother to bear any more burdens, so I started working part-time. waiting tables at a small cafe, cleaning offices at night. Those days I often slept only 4 or 5 hours a night, but I didn't complain. I knew my mother back home was still working 2 jobs, still pinching pennies to send me money. Every time I received an envelope from her with a little note saying, "Here's a small gift, buy something nice to eat," my heart ached. I wanted to tell her I didn't need it, that I could manage, but I knew she wouldn't listen. The distance and the pressure of school left little time to visit her. Phone calls became our only connection. I told her about life in Chicago, the tough exams, the new friends I made. But every time I mentioned my major, medical laboratory science, I sensed a hesitation in her voice. "Be careful, Felix," she'd say softly with a trace of worry. "A job in healthcare. It's not simple." I didn't understand why she said that. I thought maybe she was concerned I was overworking myself, or that I'd chosen a path too difficult. But deep down, I felt she wasn't entirely supportive of my choice, though she never said it outright. The college years passed in a blur of coursework, part-time jobs, and nights when I missed my mother so much it hurt. I missed the smell of her homemade tortillas, her soft humming as she did chores, the way she hugged me when I was sad. But I also remembered my promise to myself. I had to succeed, to repay her. I imagined the day I'd graduate, showing her my diploma, bringing her to a new home where she wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. That vision pulled me through the most exhausting days. I carried the promise to honor my mother with every step, and after 4 years of relentless effort, I achieved what she always hoped for. I graduated from college. But I never expected that the path I chose, healthcare, would lead me to a greater turning point, where the secrets my mother had kept hidden began to unravel. After 4 years of relentless hard work, I achieved what my mother always hoped for. I graduated from the University of Illinois with a bachelor's degree in medical laboratory science. I stood on the cusp of an unimaginable opportunity. I was recruited by Vitalis Health Group, one of America's leading healthcare corporations headquartered in New York City. The day I received the job offer, I sat in my tiny Chicago apartment, rereading every line on my laptop screen, my heart pounding. Vitalis wasn't just a company. It was a symbol of excellence, of groundbreaking advancements in biotechnology and medical research. From a kid raised on the dusty streets of San Antonio's west side, where dreams were often buried, I had stepped into a world I never dared to imagine. But before New York, the moment I'll never forget was the phone call to my mother, my voice trembling with excitement. "Mom, I graduated." On the other end, she was silent for a moment, then I heard her sob. "Felix, my boy, I knew you could do it," she said, her voice choked with pride and emotion. I wanted her to come to my graduation, to see her in the crowd with that radiant smile I'd known throughout my childhood. But she declined, saying she couldn't take time off work and that the bus fare from San Antonio to Chicago was too expensive. "You enjoy your day, mijo. I'm happy here at home," she said. But I knew she was hiding her regret. In the end, I sent her a photo of myself in my cap and gown, standing in front of the university along with a handwritten letter. "Mom, this is just the first step. I'll make you even prouder." When she received it, she called back, her voice still trembling with emotion. "You've made me proud for a long time, Felix." I moved to New York with a suitcase full of old clothes and a heart brimming with ambition. My role at Vitalis was as a laboratory technician, a job demanding precision and meticulousness. On my first day in the lab, I was nearly overwhelmed by its modernity. Rows of cutting-edge machines, screens displaying complex data, and colleagues with sharp, piercing gazes, as if they could see through every drop of blood under the microscope. I was responsible for analyzing blood samples, studying genetic pathologies, and contributing to innovative biotech projects, things I had only read about in textbooks a few years earlier. Every day at Vitalis was a challenge, but also an opportunity to prove I belonged. I was proud, truly proud. From a boy raised in poverty, I had become an employee of a nationally renowned corporation. But that pride came with an invisible pressure. I wanted to call my mother, to shout through the phone, "Mom, I did it! I'm working at Vitalis Health Group." But every time I picked up the phone, I remembered her hesitant tone when I mentioned healthcare. I didn't understand why she reacted that way, but I didn't want to upset her. So I stayed silent. I didn't tell her about my new job, the long hours in the lab, or the growing pride within me. When my mother called, her voice was as warm as ever, though tinged with exhaustion. "Are you okay, Felix?" she'd ask, and I could hear the wind whistling through the phone as if she were standing outside just coming back from work. I answered vaguely, "I'm good, Mom. I found a decent job, pays well, but it's busy. Not much free time." She'd laugh, her voice gentle but laced with worry. "Take care of yourself, mijo. Maybe find a job closer to home so we can see each other." I nodded over the phone, though I knew I couldn't follow her advice. New York was my opportunity, the doorway to fulfilling my promise to honor her. Vitalis Health Group wasn't just a workplace. It was a world of discipline and ambition. At its helm was Gabriel Harrington, a name revered by anyone in the healthcare industry. He was the eldest son of the Harrington dynasty, a wealthy family with a centuries-long legacy. In the media, he was called the Iron Man, not just for his strictness, but for his unwavering principles and refusal to compromise. I had never met him in person, but stories about him circulated through the company like legends. They said he had transformed Vitalis from a small family business into a national healthcare empire with bold decisions and far-reaching vision. He wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of success, something I, a kid from the West Side, had always aspired to. Every time colleagues mentioned Gabriel Harrington, I felt a surge of inspiration. I wanted to be like him, disciplined, strong, and undeterred by circumstances. I often imagined meeting him one day, shaking his hand, telling him how I'd overcome hardship to stand in his company. Little did I know that this man would be the key to unlocking the greatest secret of my life. My days at Vitalis passed like a whirlwind. I worked from early morning to late at night, buried in blood samples, reports, and challenging research projects. The job demanded not just knowledge, but patience and steely resolve. Some days I felt exhausted, but thinking of my mother made me grit my teeth and push forward. I told myself, I can't stop. Not now. Yet no matter how hard I tried to fit into this new world, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. New York was so different from the West Side. The streets glowed with bright lights, the skyscrapers towered above, and the people were always in a rush. It all made me feel like a stranger. I missed my mother, the little kitchen with the smell of homemade tortillas, the evenings we'd talk by the dim light of a lamp. A quiet emptiness welled up inside me. After months of relentless work in New York, I decided I had to visit my mother. I wanted to see her, to tell her about my new life, though I hesitated knowing she didn't support the path I'd chosen. The bus ride from New York to San Antonio took over 30 hours, but for me, it was a journey back to myself. As the bus turned into the familiar neighborhood, the smell of dusty roads and the chaotic streets made my heart race. I dragged my suitcase through the narrow alley to my mother's tiny house, where every brick and every crack held my childhood. My mother was busy on the porch, unaware of my arrival. When she looked up, she froze as if she couldn't believe her eyes. Her brown eyes widened, then blurred with long, suppressed tears. The old apron on her trembled with her quick, uneven breaths. "Felix, my boy," she cried, her voice breaking with both sobs and joy. She rushed to me, hugging me tightly as if afraid I'd slip away again. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of laundry soap mixed with the faint tang of Texas sun and wind. In that moment, the exhaustion of the long journey melted away, leaving only the overwhelming love between us, making me want to stay in her arms forever. That evening, we sat down to dinner in the cramped kitchen. My mother made my favorite childhood dish, stewed beans with golden, freshly baked tortillas. The dim yellow light illuminated her face, highlighting wrinkles I hadn't noticed before. She was thinner, her hands more sinewy, but her smile was as warm as ever. I took a deep breath, mustering the courage to share the pride swelling in my chest. "Mom, I found a good job in New York." I began, keeping my tone gentle. "It's stable, pays well, and the environment is professional. I think I'm on the right path." She smiled and nodded, but her eyes seemed distant. I couldn't hold back anymore. I wanted her to know I'd achieved something significant, that I was fulfilling my promise to honor her. "I'm working at Vitalis Health Group," I said, my voice rising with excitement. "A major healthcare corporation, Mom. I work in the lab researching things that could help so many people." Suddenly, the air in the kitchen seemed to freeze. The fork in my mother's hand dropped to the table with a sharp clatter. Her face paled, as if the blood had drained from her skin. Her usually warm brown eyes widened, filled with panic and something I'd never seen before: hatred. "Vitalis?" she repeated, her voice trembling as if the name itself were a knife. You're working for Vitalis Health Group?" I was stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Yes, Mom," I replied, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart. "Is something wrong?" But she didn't answer. She clenched her hands, her thin fingers interlocking as if holding back a storm. "You have to quit," she said, her voice deliberate and icy, sending a chill down my spine. "You can't work there anymore, Felix. I'm begging you." I stared at her, shocked, as if she'd become a stranger. "Mom, why?" I asked, my voice faltering. "I don't understand. This job is good, Mom. I'm doing what I've always dreamed of. Why do you want me to quit?" But she only shook her head, her eyes avoiding mine. "I'm begging you," she repeated, her voice fading into a plea. "If you love me, leave that place. Some places, they're not meant for us." I had never seen her like this. Her eyes, usually warm and full of love, were now frantic, heavy with a pain I couldn't fathom. The name Vitalis, just one word, seemed to have touched an old wound, a secret she'd buried long ago. I wanted to ask more, to understand why she reacted so intensely, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't want to hurt her, so I nodded, my voice hoarse. "Okay, I'll think about it." But deep inside, a seed of doubt began to grow, like a dark cloud rolling in. After dinner, my mother cleaned up in silence, but she was no longer the same woman from moments before. She sat by the window, staring blankly, her hands gripping the old scarf as if holding on to something slipping away. I wanted to approach her, to hug her, to ask about the reason for her strange reaction, but every time I met her gaze, I saw only a wall of silence, an impenetrable barrier. For the first time in my life, I felt acutely that my mother's love, no matter how immense, was intertwined with a dark secret she refused to reveal. That night, I lay on the old bed in my small room, listening to the wind whistle through the window's cracks. The image of my mother sitting lost in thought haunted me. I racked my brain, searching for clues about why she reacted that way to the name Vitalis. But I had nothing. Only the stories she told me about my father, the addict, the gambler who died when I was young. I returned to New York with a heavy heart, her plea to think about quitting Vitalis echoing in my mind. But I knew I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Once again, I found myself swept up in the whirlwind of New York. Long days in the laboratory at Vitalis Health Group, handling blood samples, reports, and research projects consumed all my time and energy. But no matter how busy I was, the image of my mother sitting by the window, her eyes vacant, never left my mind. I wanted to call her, to ask directly, "Mom, why are you so afraid of Vitalis?" But every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. I didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to stir up any memories that would make her cry. So I kept postponing my plans to quit or transfer jobs. I told myself, just do this job well, earn enough money, and then get Mom out of the West Side. Everything will be fine. Then one morning, the entire city of New York seemed to hold its breath. I was examining blood samples in the lab when my colleagues started buzzing with excitement, and the TV in the break room blared loudly. Gabriel Harrington, chairman of Vitalis Health Group, involved in a serious car accident. The news anchor's voice was tense. I dropped what I was doing and rushed to watch. The TV screen showed a luxury car mangled on the highway, glass shattered everywhere and blood staining the driver's seat. The news reported that Harrington was critically injured, had lost a lot of blood, and was in critical condition at New York's Central Hospital. My heart pounded, not just from shock, but from a strange feeling as if I had just lost something important. Vitalis quickly issued a nationwide emergency statement calling for blood donations. The major issue was that Harrington had AB negative blood, an extremely rare type possessed by only about 1% of the population. The state's blood bank didn't have enough reserves and time was running out. The call for donations spread everywhere, on television, in newspapers, on social media. Vitalis even pledged significant financial support for those who volunteered to donate. But when I read the announcement, my mind seemed to freeze. A B negative, my blood type. I too have AB negative blood. I stood frozen in the lab, still holding a test tube, but my thoughts drifted far away. Should I donate blood? Not for the reward, I didn't care about that. But for Gabriel Harrington, the man I admired from afar, the one I considered a model of discipline and success. I imagined him in the emergency room fighting on the edge between life and death, and the thought that I could help made my heart race. But then my mother's image flashed in my mind, her panicked eyes at the mention of Vitalis. If I donated blood, if I got more involved with this corporation, would I disappoint her? Would I push her into a pain I didn't understand? I wrestled with myself all day. I paced back and forth in my small New York apartment, staring out the window where the city lights flickered endlessly. I thought of my mother, of my promise to take care of her, of the sacrifices she had made for me. But I also thought of Gabriel Harrington, the man of steel who had inspired me from my first days at Vitalis. Finally, I told myself, this isn't about Vitalis. This is about saving a human life. The decision was made not for the reward, but because I believed that if my mother were here, she would want me to do the right thing. That afternoon, I went to Vitalis's blood donation center. The atmosphere was tense, with medical staff bustling about checking records and equipment, but there wasn't the crowd I had expected. A B-negative blood was just too rare. I signed the consent form, lay down on the donation chair, and felt the needle prick my skin as warm blood flowed out of my body. I closed my eyes, imagining my blood being rushed to the hospital. To Gabriel Harrington, a man I had never met. When I left the center, I felt a sense of relief, but also a strange sensation, as if I had just done something far greater than I could comprehend. A few days later, the news reported that Gabriel Harrington had survived his critical condition. The timely blood transfusion, combined with the care of top medical staff, had saved his life. I read the news on my phone in the lab and couldn't stop a smile from spreading across my face. I was proud, not because I was recognized, but because I had helped save a life. Little did I know that the decision to donate blood that day not only saved Gabriel Harrington's life, but also marked the beginning of uncovering the truth about my own identity. One morning, while I was examining blood samples in the laboratory, my direct supervisor walked in, her face grave. "Felix, the chairman's office just called. Mr. Harrington wants to see you immediately." My heart raced. Gabriel Harrington, the man of steel, wanted to meet me. I quickly wiped my hands, trying to stay calm, but my mind was filled with nervous excitement. I had never met him in person, only heard stories about his strictness and vision. I was led to his office on the top floor of Vitalis's headquarters. The room was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking New York's skyline, exuding an air of authority. Gabriel Harrington sat behind his desk, a tall figure with silver hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see through everything. He stood up, shook my hand, and the smile on his face caught me off guard. It wasn't the cold demeanor I expected, but warm and approachable. "Thank you, Felix," he said, his voice deep but sincere. "Your blood saved my life." I fumbled, unsure how to respond. I just did what was right, sir," I replied, trying to mask my awkwardness. But he didn't stop there. He invited me to sit down, asking about my work, my life. I told him about my days in the lab, my passion for medical research, and without thinking I let slip about the West Side, about my mother, the woman who raised me single-handedly. He listened intently, his eyes lighting up whenever I mentioned the discipline and resilience my mother had instilled in me. "You remind me of myself when I was young," he said, his voice low, and a surge of pride welled up inside me. From that meeting, a strange bond began to form between me and Gabriel Harrington. He would often call me to his office, not to discuss work, but to talk about life, challenges, and the belief in perseverance. But what I didn't expect was that he seemed drawn to me. He once said with a rare smile, "Felix, you have a sincerity that few young people possess. You remind me of someone very important." I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a compliment. But his eyes, when he said that, held a distant look, as if he were peering into the past. One afternoon, during a conversation at a cafe near Vitalis's headquarters, I accidentally dropped my wallet while reaching to pay the bill. Gabriel bent down to pick it up, and when he opened it to hand it back, the photo of my mother, the one I took during my last visit home, where she stood in the kitchen, her hair tied back with an old scarf, her smile radiant despite the wrinkles on her face, caught his eye. I smiled, about to put the wallet away, but Gabriel froze. The coffee cup in his hand fell onto the table, splashing onto his white shirt. His hands trembled, his face momentarily pale, as if he had seen a ghost. That photo," he stammered, his voice faltering. "Who is that woman?" I was taken aback, unsure why he reacted so strongly. "That's my mother," I replied, my voice hesitant. Gabriel fell silent, his eyes locked on the phone screen, as if the world around him had stopped. "Your mother?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Where does she live? What's her name?" I frowned, feeling a wave of unease. "Her name is Adriana Torres. She lives in San Antonio, Texas," I answered slowly. "Is something wrong, sir?" He tried to regain his composure, shaking his head as if to dismiss a thought. "No, nothing," he said, but his voice wasn't convincing. He took a sip of coffee, his hand still trembling, and awkwardly changed the subject. But I couldn't help but notice. His reaction, the shock, the panicked look in his eyes, reminded me of my mother, of the night she dropped her chopsticks when she heard the name Vitalis. A strange feeling stirred within me, as if a piece of a puzzle was hovering just out of reach, but I couldn't yet connect it. A few days later, Gabriel called me to his office again. This time he didn't smile or chat as usual. He looked at me, his gaze heavy, as if wrestling with himself. "Felix," he said, his voice low, "I need you to do something for me. Take me to meet your mother." I was stunned, unable to understand why he would make such a request. "Sir, my mother is in San Antonio, thousands of miles away," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But he shook his head, his eyes resolute. "I'll arrange everything. Just take me there. I need to see her." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to refuse, to protect my mother from anything that might hurt her. But Gabriel's eyes, the sincerity, the longing, and a pain I had never seen in him before made it impossible for me to say no. "All right," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll take you." The flight from New York to San Antonio felt like an eternity. I sat next to Gabriel on the plane, my mind flooded with questions. He remained silent throughout the journey, his gaze distant as he stared out the window, as if preparing to confront a part of his past he had buried long ago. I wanted to ask him, why did he need to meet my mother? Why did her photo make him tremble, causing him to drop his coffee cup? But I lacked the courage. There was something in his silence, in the way he gripped the armrest, that filled me with unease. All I knew was that this trip was far from a simple meeting. When we arrived in the west side, dusk had settled. The familiar streets of San Antonio unfolded before me, with their crooked houses and the distant sound of children playing in the alleys. I led Gabriel to my mother's small house, my heart pounding as if it might burst from my chest. I knocked on the door, and when my mother opened it, her familiar brown eyes lit up with joy at seeing me. But then her gaze shifted to Gabriel and the smile on her face vanished. She stood frozen as if time had stopped. "Felix, who is this man?" she asked, her voice trembling, though I knew she had already recognized him. Before I could answer, Gabriel stepped forward, his voice choked with emotion. "Adriana, it's me, Gabriel." The air seemed to solidify. My mother took a step back, her eyes wide with panic. "No," she whispered, her voice laced with pain. "You shouldn't be here." I was stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Mom, let's go inside," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though my heart was racing. She hesitated, her eyes still fixed on Gabriel, but then she nodded and led us into the small kitchen, where for years she and I had shared meals, stories, and dreams. We sat around the old wooden table, the dim yellow light casting shadows on my mother's face, highlighting wrinkles I hadn't noticed before. Gabriel sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly as if trying to muster some courage. I sat between them, feeling like an outsider in my own story. And then, like a dam breaking, my mother burst into tears. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of joy, but of anger, pain, and a grief that had been buried for 3 decades. "You abandoned us," she cried, her voice breaking, her hands slamming down on the table. "You chose money, power, and your family over me and my son." My head spun. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. But she didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on Gabriel, filled with hatred and hurt. And then, like a knife cutting through my heart, Gabriel turned to me, his eyes red. "Felix," he said, his voice choked. "I am your father." My world collapsed in that moment. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I had just heard. My father? Gabriel Harrington, the man of steel. The man I admired was my father? The man my mother had described as a drug addict, a gambler, who died in a car accident when I was 3. I looked at my mother, hoping she'd say it was a cruel joke, but she only bowed her head, tears falling onto the wooden table. "Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked up, her eyes red with pain. "I wanted to protect you, Felix," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was better. I didn't want you to know about a father who turned his back on us, who chose to abandon us. I'd rather you hate me than live your whole life hoping for someone who would never come back." "You don't know what I went through, Gabriel," she shouted, her voice breaking, pointing at him. "I was despised, shunned, raising Felix alone, bringing him up by myself. You have no right to sit here and call him your son." I sat there, listening to her words, feeling my heart tear apart. I looked at Gabriel, the man I had once admired, now bowing his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Adriana, I was wrong," he said, his voice choked. "Not a single day has passed that I haven't thought of you and Felix. I made the wrong choice. Please, I beg you and Felix to forgive me and give me a chance to make things right." But my mother wouldn't accept it. She stood up, pointing at the door, her voice cold but her tears still falling. "Get out, Gabriel. You don't belong here." Gabriel looked at her, then at me, his eyes filled with regret. He stepped forward, took my hand, and gripped it tightly as if afraid I'd disappear. "Felix, my son," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know I've never stopped regretting it." I wanted to pull my hand away, to scream that he had no right to call me that, but I just sat there, silent, feeling a deep crack in my heart. My mother turned away, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Gabriel left, his footsteps heavy as if carrying a lifetime of regret. When the door closed, I looked at my mother, wanting to ask 1,000 questions, but not a single word came out. I was angry at her for hiding the truth for 30 years, angry at Gabriel for abandoning us. But above all, I was in pain. Pain for both of them, the people I loved and admired, who had both deceived me in their own ways. The small house fell into silence after Gabriel left. The dim yellow light in the kitchen seemed to amplify the suffocating stillness. My mother sat listlessly by the window, her eyes vacant as if her soul had been drained in the confrontation that had just taken place. I had never seen her like this. The strong woman who had single-handedly fought the world to raise me now looked so fragile that I feared a single touch might make her vanish. I wanted to approach her, to hug her, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to soothe the pain I had only just begun to understand. That night, my mother didn't sleep. I heard her moving around in the kitchen, the sound of running water as she washed dishes, but I knew she was only trying to keep busy to avoid facing me. Finally, I couldn't bear the silence any longer. I walked into the kitchen and sat down on the old wooden chair across from her. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse, "tell me. Everything. I need to understand why." She looked up, her eyes red, tears shimmering as if they had been held back for 3 decades. Her hands gripped the old rag tightly as if clinging to the last thread keeping her from collapsing. "Felix, my son." Her voice trembled. "I know you hate me for lying, but I had my own reasons." Her voice broke, the sentence hanging in the air, and she fell silent, only the soft sound of her sobs echoing in the quiet room. And then, in that small kitchen, under the faint glow of the yellow light, my mother told me the story she had kept buried for 30 years. She spoke of her youth, when she was a dreamy immigrant girl who left her small village in Mexico to chase a new life in San Antonio. She met Gabriel Harrington at a small diner where she worked as a waitress. He was a young man then, with eyes that sparkled like they held the entire sky and a gentle smile that made her heart flutter. They fell in love, a pure, intense love, as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them. In the afternoons by the San Antonio River, Gabriel held her hand, promising to build a future together despite their different backgrounds. She believed him, believed in their love, believed they could overcome any obstacle to be together forever. But that dream shattered when she became pregnant with me. The Harrington family, a wealthy dynasty with rigid standards, discovered Gabriel's relationship with her. They called my mother lowly, an immigrant unworthy of stepping into their elite world. They insulted her, threatened her if she didn't leave. My mother recounted, her voice breaking, how she had knelt before them not for herself, but for the child in her womb, for me. She begged them to give her and Gabriel a chance, but the Harringtons cared nothing for their love. They forced Gabriel to choose, either my mother and me or his status and family inheritance. And the most painful part, she said, tears streaming down her face, was that Gabriel stayed silent. He stood there, she whispered, her voice choked, watching me be humiliated, driven away, and didn't say a word. He chose his family, his ambition, and left us behind. From that moment, my mother realized she could only rely on herself. She gave birth to me alone in a small San Antonio hospital, with only a kind nurse holding her hand through the labor pains. She faced double prejudice, as a poor immigrant woman and as a single mother with a child born out of wedlock. The whispers, the scornful looks from neighbors, from co-workers at the laundromat and street cleaning jobs, cut into her like knives. But she never let me feel that pain. She worked day and night, skipped meals so I could have books, hid her exhaustion so I could have a smile. And to protect me, she fabricated the story of a father who was a drug addict, a gambler who died in a car accident. I thought that if you hated a father who was dead, you'd hurt less than if you hoped for a father who was alive but would never come, she said, her voice choked. I didn't want you to grow up with a heart full of waiting, only to be disappointed. I sat there listening to her every word, feeling my heart constrict. I loved my mother, loved her so much I wanted to hold her tightly and tell her I didn't blame her. But at the same time, I was angry that she had robbed me of the right to know the truth for 30 years. I looked into her eyes, seeing her vulnerability for the first time. no longer the strong woman who had lifted me through our hardest days. Her tears, held back for 3 decades, now flowed endlessly as if she were releasing a lifetime of suffering. "I don't hate you, Mom," I finally said, my voice trembling. "But I need time, Mom. I need to understand why things turned out this way." She nodded, saying nothing more, but her eyes were filled with apology. I stood up, left the kitchen, my heart heavy. I loved my mother because I understood the pain she had endured. But I was also angry because the truth she hid had taken away a part of myself. And above all, I was in pain. Pain because my mother's story wasn't just about her and Gabriel, but about me, about what I had lost without ever knowing. The days following the confrontation in the small kitchen felt like being trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I returned to New York, my steps heavy as I trudged through the brightly lit streets, but my mind couldn't sync with the city's frenetic pace. In the laboratory at Vitalis, I stared at the blood samples in test tubes, unable to focus, as if everything around me was a blurred painting. The image of my mother sitting listlessly by the window, her eyes lifeless as if her soul had been drained, haunted me every second. Then there was Gabriel's gaze, filled with regret and pain as he left, cutting into my heart like a knife. I was angry at my mother, so angry I wanted to scream for hiding the truth about my real father, letting me grow up with a nameless void. I was angry at Gabriel for choosing to abandon us, leaving my mother and me to endure years of hardship. But above all, I was in pain. Pain so intense it felt like my chest was being crushed because both of them, the people I deeply loved and once admired, had left an unfillable void within me. I felt like I was standing at the edge of an abyss, unsure whose hand to hold or whether I had the strength to pull myself out of the loss the truth had brought. I didn't want my family to drown in hatred. I didn't want my mother to live forever with the pain of betrayal, nor did I want Gabriel to carry his regret to the grave. Despite the turmoil in my heart, I decided to be the mediator, trying to bring my mother and Gabriel closer, even if only in small steps. I started by calling my mother every day, telling her about my life in New York, about the busy days in the lab, to make her feel our connection. But each time we spoke, I could hear the weight in her voice, as if she were still wrestling with old wounds. After a few weeks, I mustered the courage to suggest, "Mom, I want to come visit you. And I'd like to invite Gabriel to have dinner with us, just one meal. I'm not asking you to forgive him, but I want us to try talking." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought she'd refuse, but then she sighed. "All right, my son," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "For you." I knew it wasn't acceptance, only a concession born of her love for me. But to me, it was a step forward. The first meeting took place in my mother's small kitchen in the West Side. I prepared a simple dinner, dishes my mother loved. Gabriel arrived, dressed more casually than I expected, no longer exuding the commanding presence of the man of steel. He brought a small bouquet of flowers, placing it on the table with an awkward glance. My mother sat across from him, her eyes cold, offering only a few polite words. "Thank you for coming, Gabriel," she said, but I knew she was trying not to look at him. The meal passed in heavy silence, but I didn't give up. I shared light stories about work, about New York, trying to ease the tension. Gabriel occasionally chimed in, his voice gentle, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. In later meetings, I tried to change the atmosphere. Once I invited my mother and Gabriel for a walk in a nearby park. Under the soft golden sunlight, I noticed my mother seemed less tense. She didn't say much, but at least she agreed to come along. Gabriel began to open up, sharing about the empty years after leaving us. There were days when I'd pass by a park, see a father holding his son's hand, and wish I could turn back time. He said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I never married. I couldn't because my heart always stayed with you and your mother." I looked at my mother, hoping to see a flicker of emotion in her eyes, but she only gazed into the distance, her hands clutching the old scarf tightly. I persisted, though at times I wondered what I was doing. I told my mother, Mom, if I can find it in me to forgive him even a little, please give yourself a chance to find some peace. You deserve to be happy. She didn't respond right away, but I saw her eyes soften, as if my words had touched a small corner of her heart. Over time, I noticed my mother beginning to soften. She no longer looked at Gabriel with the same hatred, though her wounds hadn't fully healed. Once during a dinner together, she let out a small, fleeting smile when Gabriel shared a humorous story from his youth. That smile, brief as it was, felt like sunlight breaking through after a storm. Gabriel, too, tried to prove his sincerity. He didn't make grand promises or try to use money or power to make amends. Instead, he listened to my mother, apologized to her, and respected her silence when she needed it. Those small meetings between my mother and Gabriel, however modest, gradually kindled a spark of hope in me. I didn't expect them to return to what they once were. Too much pain had passed. But I hoped even just a little that they could find peace in their hearts, and so could I. I stood between two worlds, but I no longer wanted to choose a side. One winter evening, as the chill of San Antonio seeped through the window cracks, I decided to organize a special dinner at my mother's small apartment. This wasn't an ordinary meal like the ones before, but an occasion for us to truly sit together, without barriers or wariness. I wanted it to be a milestone, a moment marking that we had moved past the pain to embrace something new. I called my mother, my voice gentle. "Mom, I'm coming home this weekend. I want us to have a really special dinner, and I'd like to invite Gabriel. Is that okay with you?" She was silent for a moment, but then she replied, her voice softer than I expected. "All right, Felix. I'll prepare your favorite dishes." That evening, the small kitchen seemed to come alive with warmth, despite the dim yellow light that had flickered for years. I helped my mother set the table with familiar dishes: a steaming pot of bean soup, golden slices of cornbread, and a plate of cookies made from the old recipe I'd loved since childhood. Gabriel arrived, dressed in a simple sweater, carrying a jar of local honey instead of something extravagant. As if he'd learned that in this house, sincerity was worth more than anything. My mother stood in the kitchen, her hair tied back with the old scarf, her hands deftly stirring the soup. I looked at her and noticed her eyes no longer held the coldness or caution of before. She looked at Gabriel not as the man who had betrayed her, but as a faded memory, someone she was learning to accept. The three of us sat around the old wooden table, free of the tension from previous meetings. The soft clink of spoons against bowls, my mother's quiet questions about my work, and Gabriel's gentle, careful responses filled the air. I watched my mother, seeing her smile as I shared stories of a busy day at Vitalis, and I saw Gabriel quietly observing, his eyes shining with gratitude. He didn't say much, but every word he spoke was sincere, as if he cherished every second of being there. In one moment, as my mother passed the cornbread to Gabriel, her fingers briefly brushed his. The touch was fleeting, but I saw her turn away, flustered, while Gabriel smiled. A sad but warm smile, as if he were holding on to a small treasure. The meal passed with simple stories. I talked about new projects in the lab. My mother asked if I was dressing warmly enough for New York's winter, and Gabriel shared memories of San Antonio, a place where he once felt free before being bound by family obligations. There were no grand apologies, nothing dramatic, but I felt a new connection, fragile yet genuine. This wasn't the perfect reunion of a movie, but a family, imperfect as it was, trying to find its way back to each other. As the meal neared its end, I stood up, raising a glass of fruit juice, looking at my mother and Gabriel. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotions swelling in my chest. "If there's one thing I've learned from our story," I said, "it's that the truth can hurt, but silence and lies hurt even more. Families aren't always perfect, but if there's a chance to speak, to forgive, we have to seize it. We can't wait until it's too late to realize what we've missed." My mother looked at me, her brown eyes glinting with emotion, her hand trembling slightly on the table. Gabriel bowed his head as if making a silent promise to me and my mother that he would never repeat the mistakes of the past. Then my mother took my hand, squeezing it tightly as she used to when I was a child. "Felix, my son," she whispered, her voice full of love. "I'm proud of you." Gabriel stood, bowing slightly to my mother, his voice hoarse. "Thank you, Adriana. Thank you for giving me this chance." My mother didn't respond, but she gave a slight nod, and I knew that in her heart a small piece of her pain had been eased. A few months later, Gabriel called me, his voice unusually nervous. "Felix, I want to do something for your mother," he said, "but I need your support." When he revealed his plan to propose to her again, my heart skipped a beat. He wanted to promise her a future, not to make up for the past, but to walk beside her for the years ahead. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Gabriel replied, his voice firm. "I've never been more certain, Felix. I lost her once. I don't want to lose her again." I helped Gabriel plan, keeping it a secret from my mother. We chose an evening at the small park near her house where she and Gabriel had once walked together. I invited her for a stroll, saying I wanted the three of us to watch the sunset. When we arrived, Gabriel stood under an old oak tree holding a simple silver ring. My mother froze, her eyes flickering between me and him. "Adriana," Gabriel began, his voice trembling but sincere, "I know I can't erase the mistakes of the past, but I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, making up for it, even if it's just one day at a time. Will you marry me?" My mother stood silent, tears streaming down her face. I took her hand, whispering softly, "Mom, if you feel happy, give yourself a chance." Finally, she nodded, her voice choked. "All right, Gabriel, but this time, don't hurt me again." Gabriel, overjoyed like a child, rushed to embrace her, tears of happiness streaming down his face. The wedding took place a month later in the backyard of the small house in the west side. There was no expensive wine, no dazzling lights, just a few close neighbors, some wildflowers, and a simple feast my mother and I prepared. My mother wore a plain white dress, her dark hair neatly tied with the old scarf, but her smile was more radiant than any bride I'd ever seen. Gabriel, in a simple suit, held her hand, his eyes gleaming with gratitude and love. I stood there as a witness, feeling my heart warm. The wedding didn't erase the scars of the past, but it was proof that, with sincerity and courage, we could write a new story, one of forgiveness, family, and second chances. As I watched my mother and Gabriel hold hands under the fading sunlight of the afternoon, I wondered, where would our next steps lead us? And what else did the future hold for us to discover?